All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to jump in this week early and get the video out to you. We're going to be looking over First Corinthians 8. Before I dive in, a quick note about the relational priority assessment. Michael, this weekend, the speaker at Eagle Eye, had a great point that it is true. We cannot view Jesus as simply our top priority. Rather, he is the lens through which we view everything, or the cog of a wheel, or whatever image you want to use. So to that point, tear up your assessments and don't do them. No, I think you can still do them and think about them this way. Whatever the first thing is on your list, like the left-hand side of your list, that is probably the lens through which you view everything else. It's kind of the point. So, like, let's say the first thing on your list is a student or something like that. Probably everything else you do is seen through the lens of being a student. Like that rules everything else. That's the Lord of the rest of your relationships. It manages the rest of them. So um, please do clarify that with your families, because I think that was an important point that you made that I hadn't thought about that the list could communicate that. So I was thankful for that. So anyway, please note that. Okay, and then just giving you some space. I think it's a good time of the semester to do a check-in. How's everybody doing? How's Eagle Eye? Stuff like that, knowing that everyone didn't go. But okay, so First Corinthians 8 is a really important chapter in this book. It's um, it's crucial for what Paul is going to say all the way up through 11:1, and really beyond. But that section, 8:1 through 11:1, where Paul will say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So it's really important to get the point that Paul is making, especially in verses 1 to 3. So he's saying we all possess knowledge, and that is evidently a phrase. I'm reading my Bible. That's helpful to knowing what the Bible says. We all possess knowledge. That is a phrase that the Corinthians were probably saying. That evidently they were saying. I'm tired. Eagle Eye is tired for me too. We all possess knowledge, and then there's a problem because evidently they were using this knowledge, as we're going to see, to kind of put their rights out there over and against other people. It's like, well, I have the right to do this, and I know that I have the right to do this. So, um, anyway, you'll see in a minute how it kind of pans out. So, he's basically saying that if you have the kind of knowledge that leads you to act in some kind of unloving way towards someone else, that is not knowledge that comes from God. And more than that, he's saying it's knowledge that doesn't come from being known by God. And he's going to make a really important distinction here. It's not that you have knowledge, it's that you are known. So it takes you out of the driver's seats and puts you into a passive position here. And that is, I think, pretty revolutionary for the way people typically think about things, even in the Christian life. It's not how much information can I attain or how much can I sink into my relationship with God, which is a good sounding thing, and a good thing to do. But how much are you known by God? I think is something else altogether. So I'm kind of answering the first major bullet point there. Those questions are meant to help you kind of walk through Paul's idea, but please help people get it. That's the point of these questions. However, you have to get there. Paul's primary value is love. That is his primary value here. It's not knowledge; it's love. And love comes from, in the next major bullet point, being known by God. Remember earlier that knowledge was revealed to us by the Spirit, not by some kind of self promotion. But when we are known by God, He reveals knowledge to us, true knowledge, which is often counterintuitive to the way that the world thinks about things. That's kind of almost where we've been in First Corinthians altogether so far. Okay, so where are we here? I'm just talking. So this is humbling. This is counterintuitive. It's not often how we think about knowledge. Obviously, we think about knowledge as something we kind of grasp or work for. And I'd love you to think about like what ways you've seen knowledge or even knowing things about God in Christian circles. How does that often lead to pride or arrogance? Instead, being known by God is expressed by love. Um, so I think that the important question here is the last one. Um, how do you feel like you are known by God? Now, in one sense, you might say, of course, like God is all knowing. Uh, he's he's everywhere. He made me, of course. But I think if you really think about this, that is true. That God knows us in and out, whether we want Him to or not. But there is this sense, there is a difference between wanting to open ourselves up to God and be vulnerable with Him and someone who does not care to do that. Um, it's a little bit mysterious, but there is a difference in those things, and it's very important. Something happens. How the Spirit works when we open ourselves up to Him and put ourselves in a place of vulnerability before the Lord. So I think that's really the heart of this question. Where are we holding back from God? It's not so much a question about does God know if I don't tell Him? Of course He knows, but He wants us. He's made it such that He works in a unique way when we open ourselves up to Him. So anyway, that's the idea here. That's the premise, and I'm spending some time on this because that's the premise for the next few chapters. This issue was expressed. The issue of kind of self knowledge and versus love was expressed in Paul's time through the issue of food offered to idols. So food would be offered to idols. Obviously, the idols didn't eat them because they're idols, and then the food would be sold in markets. So they would. There was this issue: should the Corinthians eat the food? Is that um, morally acceptable? And basically, what Paul and what I want to say before I move on is that we are going to address later the idea that there is such a thing as demonic activity, and we do need to be careful about how we interact with certain things that are related to worshiping gods. Okay, so I'm not denying that, and Paul isn't either. He will address it in chapter 10, but try not to go there because it's coming. Just understand the gist of his argument here, which is there is no such thing as other gods. I almost put Isaiah in there when he's like, you made this wood. Congratulations. That's a paraphrase, but this is not a god. It's wood. It's iron. It's made by you. It's nothing. And that's what Paul's saying here. So, objectively, the idea is, of course, you can eat this food offered to idols because it's nothing. Um, but if you keep reading, he says, however, not all possess this knowledge. And that's a key word. It comes up a ton if you wanted to go through and do a word study on that and highlight it. Not all possess this knowledge, but some people don't feel like they can eat it. And what I'm asking here, what is it that defiles the act of eating? If you notice in verse 7, it's their conscience. It's their conscience that defiles their eating. Now, in Romans 8, Paul addresses the same issue. Oh, sorry, Romans 14, Paul addresses the same issue. I'm going to have you read it in a second. But a key verse there is Romans 14:23, which says something along the lines of anything that does not proceed from faith is sin. And I have a personal note here for you. This verse, anything that does not proceed from faith is sin or come from faith is sin. That has been uh, transformational for me, um, because I think a lot of times I thought of sin as well, I'm not going to do this thing, and I'm not going to do this thing, and I'm not going to do this thing. Like there were these clearly there were these things that were bad, bad thing, bad thing, bad thing. Can't do those things. Not going to do those things. These are good things. I can do them. What this verse did for me was that it helped me realize that I can do a seemingly good thing in a way that is completely not God honoring because I'm not doing it in faith. I'm not doing it in a way where I'm trusting God. I'm doing it for self promotion, even, or whatever it might be. Um, so it takes sin from being this thing where, like, okay, I'm not going to do this thing, to this deeper, how am I doing this thing? Why am I doing this thing? It's deeper than action, it's intense and motives and things like that. And that really um, changed the way I thought about I did. This changed the way I think about everything that I do. And I think that if you really think about that verse, it will do the same thing for you. I really do think that's Paul's intent. And the point is here that there's this issue that is morally kind of could go either way. Uh, and and it depends on how you do it as to whether or not you're sinning. That's clear in these verses. Um, that's the highlighted questions I have there that I just answered for myself. So, um, okay. So then going on, he talks about how we need to prefer or how we need to live our life out of love and not out of this knowledge. Another word for knowledge might be freedom or privilege or choice. And I have you read the parallel account. So the point is that there are weak, quote unquote, weak brothers, and that's maybe not super kind language in English. I don't think it was necessarily offensive, but there are people who are going to take these issues that could be morally, I don't want to say morally neutral, because that's not right. It's not that it's neutral, it's that it's how you interact with it, how you think about it, the way you do them. Um, in the motive out of which you do them, or I'm trying to say it in a lot of ways so it'll make sense. Um, that determines whether or not you are sinning, right? In doing that thing. And so the weak brother is the one who struggles in his or her conscience, brother or sister, of course, in his or her conscience to do some of these things that could go either way because their conscience is pulling them away from those things. And Paul is saying, you need to not do these things in the presence of these people such that you would cause them to feel like they need to do them or be like, oh, come on, this is fine. Like, you can do this thing. Because you're going to make them sin, is basically the point. You can't make them do it, but you're going to pull them towards something that their conscience is telling them not to do. And so while the issue of meat sacrifice is prevalent actually in other parts of the world, it's not in our country, of course. And so there's some ideas that I have listed out there. And of course, know that some people will think these things are or aren't inherently sinful, and that's the point. That's a part of the conversation. And so Paul, I've already answered these questions. How does Paul's ethic of love guide us to act? And it is to abstain and to not do these things around people. Choose love over freedom and knowledge and choice and preference. That we always choose love over and above those things. And then I have you walking through some alcohol issues, because that is, I mean, there's a lot of issues. That's the issue on college campuses still. How do we as Christians interact with alcohol? So I hope you can have a good conversation about that. And finally, the last question, if you'll notice down in 11 and 12, he says, what does he say? Yeah, 12 is crazy. Thus, sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Often we think that our faith has just to do with my relationship with God, right? Michael talked about this weekend, the privatization of faith. That what I do does not affect Chelsea or whoever, it's just me and God. But that is not the right way to think about things. First of all, for just many of the reasons we talk about here, but also think about this. You are joined with Christ. We don't talk about our union with Christ very often, but if we are the body of Christ and he is the head, we are joined with him. There's some mysterious thing that happens where we are joined with Christ and we share in his sufferings, we share in his resurrection. But remember that you're not the only one that's joined with Christ. Your brothers and sisters are joined with Christ too. And so when you wound them, you wound Christ. Okay. And that is, if there's a reason to do this, it's that for the sake of Christ. And I have you looking back at 15 to 17 to show you that where I'm getting that theological founding, even in the same epistle. So, and the issue, I just want to ask you at the end, okay, how does this issue resonate with you? Like, what are you thinking? And treat them. Ask them to think of a way this week that they can choose love over these things, love over knowledge or freedom, preference. And I'd like you to write them down if you could, and ask them to take this seriously. treat this as kind of accountability and tell them, I'm going to follow up. Let's see how we can do this week. This doesn't have to be like a demanding thing, but I do want people to take these challenges seriously, and I do want you to do what you can to empower them. Sometimes you kind of have to hold their hand through these things. You have to follow up in the week, be like, don't forget, this is going on. Um, don't expect that if you say it, they're going to remember. Sometimes you have to remind them. But sometimes that's what it looks like to disciple others into these spiritual disciplines in these early stages, is to kind of walk, help them succeed. So all I got. Hopefully that helps. I will see you guys, when I see you.